Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Rad Dad podcast. We have a very special guest with us today. We're discussing maternal health, women's health as well. So we have Andrea Ippolito, the CEO and founder of SimpliFed, a maternal health tech platform, and she can go into exactly what they do and why we're having this conversation. I felt it was important. I shared with Andrea my experience with my son when he was first born on breastfeeding and not being able to and everything. My ex-wife and I kind of call it the PTSD of him being a newborn on having to jump from Elecare to Nutramigen. And for those that don't know, there's a very expensive hypoallergenic formulas. So Andrea, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you started the company, and why you started the company.
Well, thanks so much for having me. My name is Andrea Ippolito, and I'm the CEO and founder of SimpliFed. We are a baby feeding platform, and right now we serve families via virtual services, fully covered by your health plan at no cost to you, where we work with families starting during pregnancy to educate them on their baby feeding options, but then after baby's born, work with them to help support their breastfeeding and baby feeding needs, covered by health plans at no cost to them. So we are in network with health plans like Aetna. We serve all military families via TRICARE. But how I got started on this journey is I'm a biomedical engineer by background, worked in medical devices, then went and worked at the federal government, but I have a lot of telehealth experience. And then fast forward, I was pregnant with my first daughter, had her, she was born 3 weeks early. And I was so focused on, delivering her and all that stuff. And then all of a sudden I had this, 5-pound nugget and I had to keep her alive. Right. And hopefully, not just alive, but wanted her to thrive. This is our first kid. And I felt all this pressure and one of your first tasks as a parent, as you all know, is to feed this kid. And breastfeeding was super hard for me. I'm a pretty type A person on top of stuff. And I've honestly never felt so stressed, so broken. And I wanted to breastfeed, but I couldn't make it work. And we switched to formula, and formula is awesome and something that our providers are super inclusive about. For instance, whether you're formula feeding, breastfeeding, pumping, however you feed your baby, we got your back. But what I found as a new parent is that it was just super stigmatizing, and it felt like a breastfeeding versus formula, when the reality is no matter how you feed your baby, that's okay. You got to do what works for you. But I also learned that health plans are required to cover services from credentialed healthcare professionals called lactation consultants, but most health plans were not in compliance with that federal law. And so what we did is we founded SimpliFed to really improve access to baby feeding support services, breastfeeding support services, so that all families could have access to this support by credentialed health professionals. Because breastfeeding and baby feeding, whether you're formula feeding or breastfeeding or pumping, is so connected to moms with physical health and mental health. And also it's a family affair, right? It involves dads, it involves the family. And so our health professionals work with the family together. And we find that some of our best advocates and most loyal patients and customers are dads, because they see their partner struggling and want to get support for them, but for them as a family as well.
And I want to focus real quick on the part about you being a new mom and the breastfeeding thing not working out, because that was our experience with my son's mother. And I can only imagine the mental trauma and stress that she went through with that, with, like you said, the stigma of everyone. I think the classic saying is breast is best. And, and in fact, it's not. There's some times where like in your case and my son's mother's case, it just didn't work out. But I thought to myself when I was talking through it about having you on, what is the experience like being pregnant and visiting your OBG? Are there any conversations around breastfeeding and formula and which is best? And
that's one of the huge things that I realized and we realized is that there's very, very little baby feeding support or guidance starting during pregnancy. So I'm pregnant with our third daughter right now, and I just had an OB-GYN appointment this morning, and it's very focused on, all right, here's your ultrasound and here's what's coming. And then, the third trimester, you're, large and in charge and you're getting ready for labor. And the idea of baby feeding feels very much like a later problem. And so we've also find that providers, they're amazing, right? They're doing everything they can, but they have very short times to be with patients, and they have a ton they have to cover in those appointments. And often like baby feeding and what happens after you have the baby just falls by the wayside. But also OB-GYNs, who I love dearly, aren't trained on breastfeeding and baby feeding as part of their residency and training. And at best, they get an hour of education. Whereas there is a super qualified, credentialed health professional called a lactation consultant that has, anywhere from 300 to 1,000 clinical training hours. They have to pass a pretty intense, rigorous board exam, along with going through separate educational programming that is widely regarded as the gold standard of baby feeding. And, what we do at SimpliFed is our providers are very inclusive, whether you're breastfeeding or formula feeding. And so what we do actually is we partner with OB-GYNs, midwives who refer to us starting during pregnancy so that we can start educating families on what to expect with baby feeding, and then do a lot of listening during that appointment, meet with them for an hour to understand, up to an hour, I should say. If you're super busy, we'll meet with you for 15 minutes, whatever works for you. But we do a lot of listening in that appointment to understand what your goals are for baby feeding. And maybe it's, fully breastfeeding, maybe it's combo feeding, maybe it's, fully formula feeding, maybe it's exclusively pumping, whatever that is, we'll work with you to design a plan, and it's covered by health plan. So we truly are part of that, both prenatal care team in collaboration with your OB-GYN, but also your postpartum care team. And we work 100% virtually so that you can get access from the comfort and safety of your own home. Because let's face it, when you're pregnant, or especially when you're postpartum and you have that new 3D printed nugget, like, you need support, and you don't want to have to drive to another appointment when you're super tired and are on 1 to 2 hours of sleep if you're lucky. And so we work with you to get you improved access to care in a convenient location for you.
So it seems like you said, it's a lack of education from the OB-GYN's standpoint, and it's almost like there's supposed to be a handoff between them and the pediatrician, and neither one of them have the training for it. So you need that lactation consultant to be that middle person for the handoff, but they're often overlooked and not consulted. Is that correct?
Totally. Yeah. They're not seen as part of the care team. And, what's great about these lactation consultants is that they can be that source of continuity, right? They can start working with you during pregnancy. Mm-hmm. They can work with you right after baby's born. And in a case like SimpliFed, you text us, like, often from right in labor and delivery, and then we get you set up with an appointment. But we're working alongside these pediatricians and these OB-GYNs and referring back to them as needed. But we build these super trusted relationships, and we think of lactation support a lot like mental health care therapy and physical therapy, because you don't just have one appointment and you're solid and good. You need access to ongoing support. But the thing is, it feels like a very taboo topic. I know that's how I felt. And then all of a sudden you're in this like hole of despair of like, what the F am I going to do to feed this baby? My baby's dropping weight, all the things that you said at the top. And so this lactation consultant is your advocate. It's your healthcare provider. It's your best friend that will listen to you. It's your support network. And we help work with folks longitudinally starting during pregnancy, for as long as you're feeding your baby based on the needs you have.
And tell me, how can an active father participate in this? Because obviously, like you said, being a new mother, you get 1 to 2 hours of sleep. You definitely need some help on those appointments. And, while we as men do not produce breast milk, we can definitely make a bottle of formula or use the breast milk and help feed the baby so that new mom can get more sleep. How can a supportive partner participate in those appointments with SimpliFed?
So we love dads, like truly from the bottom of our hearts, because dads are often the ones that are reaching out to us because they're seeing their wife and their partner struggle, and they don't know where to turn. And so we get a lot of calls, texts, or folks filling out the forms on our website, DMs on Instagram saying like, my wife is struggling hardcore right now, and I don't know what to do. We don't know who to turn to. And so we love dads because you all are the ones that are seeing what's happening and do feel helpless and are trying to figure out what to do. And so this is what you can do, right? You can reach out to get you and your family more support. And so ways that dads can help are, one, be that hero, reach out to organizations like SimpliFed, simplifed.com. Come check us out and we'll get you support covered by your health plan for free. Like, this is a service you have access to and you shouldn't have to pay for it because it's covered by your health plan. So reach out to support services like SimpliFed. You nailed it. Secondly, like, clean the bottles, right? Make the bottles for the night, take a shift at night. And there is this big misconception that if you're breastfeeding, you can't sleep. And while breastfeeding is like a no days off thing, right? The Coach Belichick, terrible coach, but he had this great quote, right? There's no days off. It's the same thing with baby feeding and breastfeeding. It's no days off. It's frankly like you're like on shift, right? That being said, you can sleep while breastfeeding. You just have to work with your partner and be able to breastfeed, every 4 to 5, maybe 6 if you're lucky, hours, or else you get clogged milk ducts. So work with your partner to figure out a shift that you can take on the baby feeding, and maybe it's formula or maybe it's pump milk, whatever that is. So clean the bottles, book the appointments, find a shift that you can help support. But frankly, like, do a lot, be a great listener, right? As you said, you saw your partner struggling and then you reacted, and just acknowledge that it sucks. Like, it's so hard. It can be painful. But then if you work with providers like us, we try to reduce that pain, because while breastfeeding does suck, literally and figuratively, it shouldn't be painful. And
Sure.
Our providers work with patients to make sure that it is as pain-free as possible, but also to develop a plan that works for you and your family so that mom doesn't have to take on both that physical and mental burden.
So let's talk about something that recently happened with the baby formula shortage. And, what can you tell us about what caused because there's several different reports on what caused the shortage and what happened, and, what you would believe that is out there. But being someone that works in that industry specifically, what's your opinion of what happened, and how would SimpliFed help in that situation?
Yeah, so unfortunately with the baby formula shortage, it was the perfect storm of all the terrible happening at once. But it's a huge systems issue. So first off, Similac, that Abbott recall happened in February of 2022. And coronabacteria, it's something you don't want to mess around with. Unfortunately, it's pretty pervasive once it gets into a manufacturing facility. So the Abbott recall last February, shut down the number one manufacturer of formula in the United States. They make 40% of all formula. Mm-hmm. And that is the second issue, is that the formula industry is dominated by 4 major players: Similac, Enfamil, Gerber Good Start, and then Perrigo, which does a lot of the store brand formulas. And the one that makes the most is Similac or Abbott. And so when that went down, it put so much stress on essentially the whole formula industry. But the problem is, and this is where the perfect storm came in, is that because where we're at, 2 years or a year and a half post-COVID, is that pretty much every company was facing massive supply chain issues. And the formula industry was not immune to that at all. And so the strain got put on the other manufacturers, but the other manufacturers were already facing supply chain issues. And the thing about formula, you can't just take out an ingredient and replace it, like mac and cheese, Kraft mac and cheese. Like, I'm obsessed with it still. Like, they can just take out one ingredient and put another if your supply chain is off, right? And I'm slightly generalizing, but you can't do that with formula, because when a formula has been FDA approved, it's FDA approved for that formula and all the specific ingredients in it. And the thing is, you can't just, even if you could replace, say, the oil blend might not be right. And because formula needs to stand alone as a sole feeding product for an infant, like my first daughter was pretty much exclusively formula fed. And so she needs to make sure that she was getting all those fats, right, as part of her growth. And so if you upset, say, the fat or oil balance, then a baby might not be getting all the nutrients they need to grow and thrive. So basically, the supply chain issues put stress on the existing formula shortage. And then the last straw was, as part of those supply chain issues, we had this war in Ukraine. And one of the major ingredients in many formulas, not all, is sunflower oil. And guess who makes the most sunflowers in the world? Is Ukraine. And so, like, literally a perfect storm of terrible. But the summary is that we need way better formula, way better baby feeding infrastructure, more resilient infrastructure. We shouldn't have only 4 manufacturers. That's crazy. And we need to have more manufacturing in the US and better backstops for this, because we can't have our most vulnerable humans not being fed.
No, and I remember hearing during that time of great stress for a lot of families that even some families were purchasing formula from Europe. And it was said that it was healthier, it was safer, and they could buy a case of 30 packs. And they were confident that they were getting what they were ordering, and they were good. They knew they didn't have to worry about going to the store and not having that formula there. Do you think that it'd be more common, or we'll see a more quote unquote natural formula producer here in the US soon?
So the thing about those European formulas is that was all the rage even before the formula shortage, that there was quite literally this illegal importation of formula from Europe. And I'm here to share like a dirty secret. All formula is pretty much the same. And whether it's made in Europe or whether it's made in the US, and especially all formula is made in the US, is that it is pretty highly regulated. And in Europe, it's regulated as well. And all formula has what you need for your baby to grow and thrive. And so sometimes before the formula shortage, you would see folks importing formula from Europe. And yes, it's more biodynamic, but no matter what your formula is, your baby is going to be okay. It's a great, safe option. But I do think, but during the formula shortage, restrictions were lifted, so you could more easily work with those European and other overseas manufacturers. And I do think there will be something interesting that will stay with that. And currently, we do see some of these overseas manufacturers, but SimpliFed is actually really an advocate for, no matter how you feed your baby, formula is a great choice, and all formulas are safe unless they get recalled. So you got to listen to those regulators and make sure that if you're in that situation, that you're not using that formula, but also making sure that you're heating up formula and per the guidelines, so that it's super safe for your babies.
Sure, and you mentioned the infrastructure and supply chain issue, which seems to be happening almost in every industry. And I think it's one thing that we can learn from the pandemic is, we need to change up how some of these things are. I know you said it was a perfect storm, but I think we say that a lot nowadays because of the pandemic. Well, it's a perfect storm. This happened and that happened, supply chain. What are some steps you think the industry could take to help prevent a future shortage?
Yeah. So big thing is we need more US based infant formula manufacturers. So what do I mean by that? So right now, formula, there's very few sites in the United States that make formula. So when Abbott and that Michigan plant went down, it literally destroyed a significant chunk of the formula produced in the US. And there's a few reasons why there's so few formula manufacturers in the United States. One, it's a super regulated product, which is good, right? Like babies, like they need formula. It needs to have all the nutrients, and it is regulated enough so that babies get what they need to grow, especially if formula is their only food source. So, but the issue is it's really hard for new manufacturers to come in. A new manufacturing facility minimum is $50 million. And especially with what happened in the last year, there's even more scrutiny. So that's one big reason why there hasn't been a lot of formula manufacturers. It's super expensive. It's highly regulated. But the third and probably like arguably biggest reason is that there are these big kahunas that exist. Abbott, Enfamil, Gerber, Paragon, which makes the store brand formula. And so when a new manufacturer tries to come in and maybe they're able to raise some capital and maybe get some investments from the state, they see Abbott announce, who was the whole, cause of this formula shortage. They see them come in and say, we're going to build another $500 million facility. And so it just really restricts competition and folks from coming in. So we saw that in New York State, right? A New York State infant formula manufacturer was hoping to build another manufacturing facility in New York State, but then they saw the Abbott announcement and they got scared off. And so this is sadly what happens. And we need more competition in this arena. We need more US-based manufacturing of formula. So what I think can be done is, one, we need more US-based infant formula manufacturers. But because of these big guns that are kind of restricting the competition, we need federal and state co-investment alongside private institutions to build more infant formula manufacturing facilities here in the US. We need more resiliency with the supply of formula here in the US, whether that's sunflower oil or what have you, because if another pandemic happens or who knows what could happen, we need more US-based produced supplies and raw materials so that we can make formula here in the US, because babies need this. And it's so vital, and it's such a disservice to families if we're not able to feed our youngest humans and our youngest citizens here. And so we need more US-based manufacturers, better supplies, but also we just need more resilient baby feeding systems across the US. I mentioned that SimpliFed provides services fully covered by health plans at no cost to them. We need more health plans cover baby feeding support so that parents get access to support, whether that's breastfeeding, formula feeding, combo feeding, pumping, so that parents can help do what they need to do to get their baby fed.
That's great. I appreciate that insight. And one thing I want to talk about is my comment earlier about breast is best. It's natural, so it should be the best. And obviously, SimpliFed takes the standpoint of, if you want to breastfeed, that's great. If you want to go full formula, go ahead. And if you want to combo feed, do that too. And I look at it kind of like the labor and delivery plan. There's always got to be a plan B, because it's never going to work out. I mean, with my son. We had scheduled for a natural birth, and that didn't happen. He was breached, so then we had an emergency C-section. So in my head, that's kind of how I view, a feeding plan. That's plan two. You get the baby, here's plan one. Plan two is, now what do we do with the feeding, this little nugget, as you called it. So tell me a little bit about that. How does the evaluation go? Of course, a lot of it's on the preference of the mother and the father. Walk me through a little bit of that process.
Yeah, so we start working with folks during pregnancy, and we do a lot of listening. So what are your goals for baby feeding? And to your point, like, you can have a plan, But one of the things our providers will do, we'll talk to them about what this will look like in real life. So let's give some like actual real examples here. So your goal, if your goal is fully breastfeeding, and the provider will work with you and educate you a little bit about what that means in the first couple weeks. As an example, a lot of people don't realize that at first, your milk doesn't come often flowing right through. You deliver the baby, and I thought like, oh, milk just comes sprouting out. Well, that's not how it works, right? It's droplets at first. And so your provider will work with you to set that expectation, and also what to do, right? With hand expression, et cetera, during those first few weeks. Milk often takes 2 to 5 days to come in. No one told me that for the first pregnancy. So I thought I was failing, but actually I was probably doing a pretty rad job. Like I was probably killing it, but I thought it was just going to be flowing out. And so when I saw these little droplets, I immediately thought I was failing. So we work really hard to set expectations with parents on what baby feeding looks like, especially in that first week or two. And this is so important. This is important for dads to know. When a woman doesn't reach her breastfeeding or baby feeding expectations, she's much, much, much more likely to be diagnosed with postpartum depression. And this has been proven time and time again in the medical literature. So that's why it's so important, dads, that you advocate for your partner to get support starting during pregnancy, and you be a part of that. And, organizations like SimpliFed do it virtually. So you can have, the game in the background, whatever, and be able to get this support during pregnancy, because it's important that parents know what to expect. Mm-hmm. Let's say your goal is combo feeding. But you want to be able to produce enough so that if you wanted to switch to fully breastfeeding, you have the ability. Well, it's super important to set expectations on what keeping up your supply looks like. So it's feeding every so often, and the provider will work with you to develop a plan. But again, breastfeeding is a no days off thing, and you got to keep your supply. It's a lot like supply and demand. You have to keep doing it to keep it up. Especially this protects mom's health, because if you don't do it often enough, your supply will go down. And if breastfeeding is your goal, then that's not ideal. But secondly, if you don't evacuate the milk, then it starts to kind of get clogged, right? It starts to clog your milk. It starts to curdle, right? You can picture what this looks like, right? You've seen this happen to milk outside the body. So same thing happens in a boob. And if it starts to curdle, so to speak, then it can get infected, and that infection can very quickly turn serious. So, and what that infection is called is mastitis. So, I had a clogged milk duct with my second kid. I went from a 99 temperature to a 102 to a 104 within 4 hours. And if I hadn't gotten antibiotics, I was starting to get like cold sweats. It was really bad, but I got antibiotics right away, thankfully. And immediately I felt better. And so what we do in that case, right, of combo feeding, the provider will work with them to talk about how do you upkeep supply, but also how do you work as a team, as a family, so that dad can participate, what, combo feeding looks like, safe preparation of formula looks like, et cetera. And if your goal is fully formula feeding, then the provider will work with you to figure out what formula works for you, different types of formulas for different types of needs, safe preparation of formula. So it's really important that that provider, prenatally, ideally, works and understands the goals. We haven't talked about pumping. If pumping is part of that goal and plan, say you're going to be transitioning back to work after a couple weeks and you want to be able to breastfeed and pump, how do you select the right pump for you? But also, a lot of people don't realize you need to get sized for a pump. And if you're not using the right size pump, then this can cause a ton of pain. And so that's another really important thing that can happen starting during pregnancy. And the providers can work with you to figure out the right pump for you, but making sure they're getting sized properly. So these are all examples or mini case studies of the types of things they go through. And as you can see in all of them, it's so connected to mom, physical and mental health, but also overall family health as well.
So to me, it seems like, I mean, to use a sports analogy, it seems like a lot of this stuff is blocking and tackling, and it's being
Yes.
missed. Is there a reason it's being missed? Because everything you're saying makes sense to me logically. And working in the healthcare industry, I understand there are a lot of hurdles and obstacles that get in the way with what I would call almost a steady flow of healthcare. And it seems like that's not happening, and it's women's health. And we hear a lot about women's rights, women's health, and it sounds like it's just not happening in the healthcare space, especially for new moms.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for asking this. Thanks so much for bringing attention to this. And I think it's dad leaders like you and dads being advocates for your parents. And so what you're talking about is just generations of systemic issues in women's health and maternal health. And sadly, the United States is the most dangerous of first world countries, of wealthy countries, to deliver in across the world. The most dangerous country to deliver a baby. And that should be shocking to everyone, whether you're a man or a woman, but, especially if you're a dad, like that's terrifying. We also know that Black women are disproportionately impacted, 3 times more likely to die in the perinatal period, than white women. And so there's just some huge disparities here. But overall, maternal health needs a massive upgrade. We also know that the amount of NIH funding that's going to women's health is way less than the amount of funding that's going to issues associated with men's health. And so there's just been, decades and decades and generations of just massive underinvestment and support for women and having babies. And that starts in around childbirth. And this might be a little TMI, but I mentioned I'm pregnant with my 3rd kid, and I had preeclampsia with my first daughter. And preeclampsia, for those that don't know, it's when your cardiovascular issues are impacted and there's too much protein kind of getting spit out of your system. It impacts your blood pressure. And basically once it gets to be bad, the only treatment is to deliver the baby. But because I had preeclampsia with my first kid, they're like more cautious on it. And that's because frankly, I advocate for myself a lot. And so I had to do a 24-hour urine test. And so what do you do for a 24-hour urine test? You walk around with a jug of your urine. It has to be refrigerated. Let's talk about the flaws in this process, right?
Wow.
Like you can't miss a pee or else it's off. What if you forget and wake up in the middle of the night? So what happens? People don't do it because the test sucks. It's super a high fail rate, right? It's usually not very accurate. And so you have preeclampsia, which is like a huge killer of moms in around birth, that's reliant on a mom carrying around a jug of her own urine. And so like these are the reasons why parents and moms are dying in childbirth. And it's because it's been massively underinvested in and undersupported. And we haven't really developed these pathways that catch these issues early and often and proactively. And that's a big reason that why we exist, SimpliFed exists, is to help support, be that additional care provider on the team to advocate for moms as part of this process. And sorry for the TMI talking about urine.
Oh, it's fine. Like I said, I work in healthcare, so I talk about a lot of stuff that doesn't even faze me. And I'm like, did I just say it that way? I didn't mean to phrase it that way. It sounds like I don't have a heart, but I'm looking at numbers and diagnoses. So, but one thing I wanted to touch on a little bit, and you may or may not have the answer for it. I know a huge majority of women are diagnosed with postpartum depression after giving birth, and like you said, that coupled with not being able to breastfeed, you kind of feel like you're a failure for lack of a better term, failure as a woman, because that's what women are supposed to do, is breastfeed their baby. And I know my ex-wife felt like a failure because of that, and there was a lot of conversation around you shouldn't feel like a failure, but there's more data coming out and more reports that SSRIs don't do what they're supposed to do. Like they were touted to help with depression. Is there any data out there showing that SSRIs inhibit breast milk and then the creation of breast milk?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of it needs to be on a case by case basis with your, mental health professionals and providers and physicians. But that's one of the number one reasons why folks stop breastfeeding as well, because once they're on medication and the answer annoyingly is it depends, right? And it depends on your unique needs. But what we do know is that, baby feeding is so tied to mental health. And one of the things we talk about, right, is no matter how you feed your baby, formula feeding, breastfeeding, pumping, donor milk, whatever that is, you got to do what's best for you as a parent and as a mom. Your mental health matters. Who cares if you're successfully fully breastfeeding if you are in shambles, right? Mom and her physical and mental health matter. And getting professional support, whether that's from baby feeding experts like lactation consultants, mental health professionals, they can work with you to figure out what the right plan is for you to ensure that you get access to the medications you need if you are faced with a perinatal mood disorder, but also doing things based on evidence. And so the annoying answer to your question is it depends, and it's got to be done in collaboration with your healthcare professionals.
No, I know it's annoying, but it's actually a great answer. One of the things I said consistently about the pandemic was there's no one size fits all solution to anything. And I hope that's one of the main things people learned was you can't give, a certain mandate or policy for New York and Texas and expect it to function the same, because the people aren't the same, the politics aren't the same, the cultures aren't the same. So it's, you may think it's an annoying answer, but it's an accurate answer of that. It depends. And then on top of that, if you want to take into account that, that new mother's own personal medical history, then it gets even more complicated. And we forget about things like that. And I think often, especially with baby feeding, we forget at the end of the day that we're still animals, that we're still a mammal. And, there is a tie-in of, closeness with the mother and the baby with breastfeeding. But if you can't physically do that, or that's not an option, well, you still want to have your baby. So you should feed them with formula and keep them healthy and growing. So I think a lot of times we need to take emotion out of it and look at it from a science standpoint of, hey, this is a mammal. What should we do? What would we do if this were a mammal in the zoo? Yeah, we'd create formula and give the baby formula. And, it happens all the time. And like you said, there's a lack of funding there from the NIH. And I don't think I even have to look at the decision makers at the NIH, but I can almost guarantee you they're a majority male board making those decisions, like you said, funding more of men's health than they do women's health.
Yeah, we know a few years ago, I applied for what's called an SBIR grant, Small Business Innovation Research Grant. And it was, my grant was not surprisingly about, breastfeeding and baby feeding. And we got rejected. Fine, it's competitive. But then I looked at my panel of reviewers, and 17 out of 20 were dudes. And we got comments like, baby feeding is not a huge pain point. And we just got all sorts of comments like that. And I was like, what planet are you on? And so we know that decision makers, and we know that women tend to invest more in women, right? So we need that support, right, of both genders as part of decision makers and funders. That's so critical. And we do know that women's health is massively underinvested in. To tell a tangent story, my mom is a badass. She's an electrical engineer. Before she was an electrical engineer, she actually was part of the team that designed women's spacesuits for the shuttle astronauts. And she was
cool.
on Yeah, right. Super cool. She was on a team of like 50. They were subcontractors to NASA. It was a 50-person team that she worked with. Only 2 were women. And this was in like the late 70s, early 80s when there was the first female astronauts. And so they like needed to like redesign the shuttle chute, which is good, right? So speaking of urine again, apologies to keep talking about this, but the way they were going to design women going to the bathroom in space was like sticking this like terrible device up her vagina. It was just going to be terrible. And my mom and like the other woman were like, yo, you can't do that. Like it's not able to function. And then, another story was Judy Resnick, who was supposed to be one of the first American woman in space, but she was like a bold and, what folks would call aggressive, but she just stuck up for herself. And she stuck up for herself saying that the space shuttle suit was going to be like super hard, like pressing on her boobs up top. Mm-hmm. And so she would advocate for herself. And then they got a more flexible material. But the reason I bring all that up is that we need like women at the table, right? Designing stuff. We need women at the table investing in things that matter alongside men. And that's why I love dads, because I think you all see it. Like you see as part of this maternal health journey, your partner's struggling and you're speaking up. My husband was the one who caught my preeclampsia when we were in labor and delivery, and he was the one advocating for me. So just to like bring it all back around, like dads, you matter, your voice matters, and you speaking up and you can advocate for your partner and your wife, but you can, or whomever. But also when you see things like women's health being massively underinvested in, things like that, you can speak up too. It doesn't need to be, the burden doesn't need to be all on the mom.
No, yeah, I would agree. Your mom sounds like a badass. So, and if she hasn't, I would highly recommend that she watch the Apple show For All Mankind. I'm
obsessed with that show.
Yeah. So it's alternative history, and they have, those female astronauts in there that you're like, they're badasses. Like they're right there with the men doing everything.
Yeah. There was a study actually in the 1950s. I'm a space nerd, that shows that women actually would be better astronauts because of just like physiological, whatever. We're like, in terms of fitting into crevices and flexibility, all that kind of stuff. But people overlook that data, sadly. So it took a little bit longer.
Yeah. No, so I would agree with you. I think one of the solutions besides more funding for women's health would be actually getting a female perspective on things. And like you said, your grant review committee, 17 guys out of 20 people on the committee. We're not going to know anything about breastfeeding as men, or we'll know very little, I should say. And I mentioned earlier before the podcast, I felt helpless when my wife at the time was going through that. Like, what can I do to help? Yeah, I can clean bottles, I can make formula, but I think there needs to be more support on the mental health side. And I'm a huge, advocate for mental health. And I think as men, we're getting more comfortable with talking about it throughout the years. And I've always said the progression of this podcast has been, we used to talk about this at bars, and then it transferred over to the barbershop, and then it transferred to social media, which is not a good area to talk about anything mental health wise. And then it's slowly progressed into talking on a podcast and talking with your friends again. And one thing that I've wanted to accomplish with the podcast is talking about some of these quote unquote difficult conversations with your friends and family again, and talking to, another dad you may know who, now you have a newborn and they just had a newborn a year ago. Hey, what did y'all do for this? Little Timmy's struggling. He's not latching. And, my wife feels like she's not a woman because she can't breastfeed. And I think having that together on a single platform or a coexisting platform would be a great solution.
Yeah, it's so true. Like we get dads calling us that some are, loud and proud. They're like, yo, my wife's struggling. I Googled you all. I heard about you on a podcast, what have you. And they're, unafraid, and they come to us. And then we get a lot of dads calling us like, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to be calling and being here, but my partner, my wife is really struggling. And I'm here to share with all of you, like, we love hearing from dads, like come one, come all, because we know that you're listening and watching what's happening to your wife and partner, and you're seeing that they need help. And maybe they just had a crazy, huge medical procedure of giving birth, and you don't know which way is up at that point. So what I just really appreciate about everything you're saying is that you all need to be the eyes and ears and be that hero for your wife or partner or girlfriend or whomever, because they are struggling. They have just had this major physical, whether it was a C-section or vaginal delivery. And so you need to be that advocate. And so we love when dads reach out to us, come to our website, simplifed.com, seriously, because this is your task too. And one of the things we hear a lot of parents say is that, they outsource that task to dad to pick like what bottle, what have you. Well, outsource this task, outsource scheduling this prenatal appointment to prepare for having a baby, or outsource, on day 3, y'all are home and trying to figure out what to do with baby feeding, outsource calling organizations like SimpliFed to get support from a lactation consultant to the dad. And so we appreciate you, and we are here for you as well. And if you need to ask any questions about, how breastfeeding or boobs work with feeding your baby, we will happy to do one-on-one dad appointments too. And so that's super important that that there are resources, whether they're baby feeding resources or mental health care resources, that are available for you and your team, which is your family.
Gosh, I remember the choosing of the bottle being outsourced to me. And if anyone has ever had to do that, they understand why I'm laughing about it now, because there is a plethora of bottles, and you read all of them and, well, that sounds like that's the best one. And you read the other one, well, this sounds the same and it kind of sounds better. So I think I bought 5 different versions of a bottle, and, we just tried each one. Which one's going to work? I don't know which one's going to work. And I think I told you, but my son had some feeding issues early on, and he had colic, he had reflux, he was tongue-tied as well. So we had to thicken his formula. So that was an extra cost on top of that. And it was again, I think it goes back to why we keep calling it a formula, is because it is a scientific formula to create it to make sure you get all the nutrients. And there are, food scientists that come up with that. And tossing that extra liquid in there to thicken it up, changes everything. And there was times that I would shake the bottle. I'm like, okay, this is a milkshake right now. There's no way this little baby that has a hard time sucking on a nipple is going to get that through. So then we had to thin it out. And it was a process that was just trial and error. And it sounds like we should have had SimpliFed, and we could have worked through that a lot better. Like, hey, we can't get the consistency down. Let's try to come up with a formula.
You nailed it, right? It's like what you just described. Like, you don't know what you're doing as a parent, like with that scenario. You need a trained healthcare professional to walk you through it. And a lot of times people see our provider name of lactation consultant, and they're like, oh, well, if I'm combo feeding or formula feeding, I can't see that provider. Well, I know from our provider perspectives that, they work with you on breastfeeding, they work with you on formula feeding, and safe preparation and use of formula is a key part of their clinical competencies. And not a lot of people know that there is this clinical specialist. They are specialists. I'm not a provider, so I should have said that, full disclosure. But I know our providers are clinical specialists, and they will work with you to troubleshoot exactly what you're saying. Whereas if you didn't get that support, you're left in the dark, right? And you're, like you said, trial and error, but it shouldn't take that. It shouldn't take that. There are trained professionals that are covered by your health plan for free at no cost to you that can help you work through those issues. And they're a member of your family's care team, but oftentimes they're forgotten.
Yeah, I felt like I was Bryan Cranston in Breaking Bad in the middle of the night, just putting the formula together, trying to figure it out. Oh, that didn't work. Let's make it over here. Like I felt like a trailer park chemist, if you will, trying to put this together and figure it out. And it was frustrating because, like I said at the beginning, I felt that was my way to contribute to the baby feeding, was making the formula, and it was difficult and figuring out, not only which bottle, but how to clean the bottle and make sure it was sanitary to reuse and how to do it and all that. I wish we would have had that in 2013 when we had Christian, because life would have been a little bit easier. I couldn't guarantee it would have been a heck of a lot easier, but I know having those answers would have been great, and to lean on that specialist during that time of need. And, speaking of time and need, the pandemic put us all in that situation where, I think you put it in your email, we're all working parents. No matter if you're a stay-at-home parent or you're, at work doing that, we were all forced into that position with the pandemic, especially with the lockdowns. And I remember, gosh, there's several times I'd be on conference calls and Christian would be on his Zoom classes and I'd hear something there and then, hey, Dad, it's time for lunch. And I'm like, well, I'm not done with my call yet. I can't feed you. Your schedule doesn't match up with mine. And, what can we learn from that process to better serve parents during that, early development stage when you're at home with your newborn, feeding them? And, one thing that I've had a discussion on with friends is the lack of paternity leave for fathers in America. I have a good friend of mine. He's been on the podcast. His company provided 8 weeks, and it was fantastic. He was like, dude, I still worked because I didn't know how to do anything else. I didn't know how to stay home. He goes, but I was able to help my wife with our kid during the day so she could sleep and she can get some rest. And it's one thing that still isn't mainstream in America, and I think that would help a lot. What do you see from your standpoint, since you are specifically in the maternal care industry? What are some things we should change to help make this whole process of raising kids easier?
Yeah, well, I am obsessed with this question. So you nailed one of them. So one is paid parental, emphasizing parental leave. So that's both mom and dad. And what we know from the research is that if men don't take parental leave, women have no hope of being able to advance in the workforce because they will always be one step behind. Mm-hmm. But how we get to, equity and equality and ensure that we're on equal footing is by having equivalency with leave. And what that means is both dad and mom having access to paid parental leave. Like you said, this is a crazy, huge medical procedure that the mom has gone through. And they need time to physically and mental recover. And you have this newborn nugget, right? 3D printed, fresh out. And that takes time and there's no sleep. And so you need a village, and that village includes both parents. And so that's one major thing. Secondly, and this impacts both parents, all parents are working parents, whether you work inside the home, outside the home. But secondly, we need universal childcare support. Okay, so what am I talking about here? I'm talking about, from when they are under 5, right? We get access to K through 12 education, but there's a whole missing piece of early childhood education, and that's, pre-K and daycare. And right now, parents have to pay for that often themselves. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. My phone went off. So we need access to universal childcare support. So this allows for those that want to be in the workforce, both mom and dad. And why that's important is because women are half the workforce now, whether you like it or not. And yet we don't have those workplace infrastructures that have evolved. And by the way, by having access to universal childcare support, that's good for dad too, right? That frees up your ability to be in the workforce as well and have that access to that support. And why that matters, like take out just like the social side of it. We know that because women are half the workforce now, our economy depends on it. So I'm super big capitalist, right? If we want to be an economic engine here in the US, we need to support our economy. And how do we support our economy? We better support half our workforce so that they can be in the workforce for those that want to, so that we can have profitable companies or successful organizations. And so universal childcare and making sure folks can be in the workforce that want to be in the workforce unapologetically is so critical. So paid parental leave, universal childcare support, and then very selfishly, we need enforcement of policies such as health plans covering breastfeeding and baby feeding support. This is a federal policy that has been around for a decade, but yet no one's enforcing it. And that kind of blows. And so we need folks advocating to health plans to cover these services because they should be covered at no cost. And again, that impacts both mom and dad.
Oh, absolutely. It affects both parents. And, I think friends that know me the best know that I don't really shy away from very many topics. And one of those topics is equal pay for men and women. And I believe the statistics is, women make 73 cents on the dollar for men. And I often say that that's inaccurate because of what we just discussed on women having to be home and leaving the workforce for a year or more. Now they have a gap in employment. Now it's difficult to find a job again. And if you do find a job, you have to take lower pay than what you were making. So there's no real one way to compare what men and women are paying unless it's industry specific. And you say, hey, a doctor who's male and a doctor who's female in this specialty get paid the same. That yes, 100% it should be that way. But to say a doctor should be paid the same as the receptionist, no, absolutely not. You can't just say because they're male and female and you're comparing it now. So it's more complicated than that. It's back to your answer earlier of it depends. And is there equal pay? Probably not. Our history has shown that. But I don't know what it is. I don't know what the answer is. It's a difficult question. And it takes more data and more conversations to come up with that answer. And I state that all the time. I've had numerous discussions during the pandemic on, civil rights, equal rights, reparations, women's rights. And every time I come back to, we need to have more discussions like this. It's not a taboo topic to talk about. We need to discuss it. It's not it's not bipartisan. There's not two sides of this whole thing. It's a complicated system, and it's funny. One of my favorite scientists. We were talking about how we're both nerds, and I always tell people I'm an overeducated idiot. But at the end of the day, I'm still a nerd. And one of my favorite scientists is Dr. Weinstein and his wife, and they're evolutionary biologists, and they talk about. They're like, oh, imagine that. A complex organism is complex. It's not as simple as saying, take this shot and everything will go away, or take this vitamin. And he's like, we're complex organisms. Viruses are complex organisms. They evolve. So I think that's the same thing. It's the same answer and the same mindset that should be for a lot of these issues that we have. It's a complex topic. And what we know about complex topics is it takes discussion and it takes compromise even to discuss it and compromise and say, hey, I don't thoroughly agree with that 100%, but I'm willing to compromise on it because I think it's for the greater good, or I think it would be beneficial to this group of people that have traditionally been underserved.
100%. I totally agree. And that's exactly the issue with equal pay. So sometimes we're not willing to have discussions, talk about the nuances of it. We know that, women are taking one day off more than men often. They bring down to a 4-day work week rather than a 5-day work week. And we know that contributes to the disparities, but it takes discussions. And I tell folks, you talk about taboo topics. I tell people, I run a breastfeeding and baby feeding company, and you can see the shudders. Oh, breastfeeding boobs. I don't know if we can talk about this. Well, Alex Earl, right? Super big TikTok star. I'm a fan. Her boobs are beautiful. But the second baby feeding or breastfeeding gets brought up with a beautiful pair of boobs, it's oh God, we can't talk about that, or we can't, that can't be on social media, what have you. And so these taboo topics it's so important that we talk about it, right? And it's uncomfortable, but that's actually how we have discourse and we learn, but also evolve as a society. And so I love it. And no, you don't all have to agree on everything, but you got to be able to talk about it so that we get better support families across the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's one thing I like to do. We're running up on time, and I always like to end with, what kind of advice do you want to give your children? And it could be specific to what we're talking about today or just in general.
So advice that I give my kids, I have 3 daughters, and they asked why a lot, right? They're constantly questioning things, and they're constantly trying to figure out, their role and their path. And I think it's super important that you figure out your own path. And I love, speaking of dads, my husband will expose them to a lot of women athletes, a lot of male athletes, a lot of women scientists and engineers. And so the advice I would give them is just try on things, fail, learn a lot in the process, and get exposed to a lot. Marion Wright Edelman, you can't be what you can't see. So just try things on for size. It's okay if you fail, because often you'll fly, and maybe sometimes you won't always. And that's definitely the mentality that my parents taught me. And I'm working hard to teach my daughters, but holy moly, I fail along the way for sure.
No, that's beautiful. I appreciate that. Because your background's an engineer, your mom was an engineer. I can almost guarantee you that you didn't get anything right on your first try.
Heck yeah, that's true. I like to say, failed out of, I sometimes teach right now and to undergrad and graduate students, and I see their faces and they're so stressed. And I'm like, look, you too can fail many exams in colleges and come back and teach engineering at the university level. And that's certainly what I did. And so I was taught that, learning mindset pretty early on. And I try to instill that in my kids. But again, I'm failing alongside them too.
Well, hey, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I love that we were able to discuss this topic on the podcast, because like you said, dads are important in the whole process. So are mothers. And, it's great. Congratulations again on being pregnant with your 3rd child. I know your husband will be there to support you. And if you have breastfeeding questions, that exactly who to go to with SimpliFed.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for having the conversation. Come check us out, everyone. SimpliFed.com. Follow us on @SimpliFedBaby on Instagram. We'd love to support you and your family. And it's covered by your health plan at no cost to you.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for joining us, Andrea. I appreciate it. Everybody else, look up SimpliFed. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me or the SimpliFed team, and we'll get you squared away. So join us in the next episode. We'll have another awesome guest, and y'all have a safe day and have a good one.